Well, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Friday Reporter podcast. I have no idea how today's guest sleeps. This is probably the busiest journalist I will talk to this, at least, very least this month. Chris Cillizza not only is The Point, which is his YouTube show and a newsletter and a variety of other means of how you get your best political news. He is CNN's political reporter, editor at large, host of a podcast called Downside Up, and author of a new book. So thanks for taking 30 minutes for me, Chris.
Man, it's wonderful to do. When I hear it that way, it feels more daunting than it does day in and day out.
Well, that's good to hear because let me tell you what, I was going through all the fresh stuff that you have out there and I was like, I don't know when he finds time to do all this stuff.
The one thing that the one skill that has helped me in journalism that I just natively have is the ability to write fast. That helped with the book too, just because I mean, you're churning out. I figured I started in January 1st, 2022. I started writing 500 words a day for the book, at least. That was my editor's suggestion. Write 500 words a day. And then by the time we get to the summer, you'll have big chunks. They won't be connected necessarily, but you'll have big chunks and it won't feel like you're starting from pure scratch, which was like the best possible advice because 500 words a day doesn't feel terribly daunting.
Manageable.
And yeah, totally manageable. And I did it, I would write 500 words about one thing and then 500 words about something else. And so it felt kind of fresh. And I was doing interviews for that time too. But that did help because I think when you're talking about a book, 60, 70,000 words, it's really daunting to think of, okay, all I have to do is produce 60,000 words is a lot harder than, okay, do 500 words a day and then let's see where we are 6 months on. Sure. Which is good. I think good writing advice in general is, just force yourself to do a little bit every day. And that little bit becomes a lot bit as you get down the road.
Were those 500 words though informed by what you're doing in your reporting, or were they a little bit? They were okay.
A little of both, honestly. I mean, I've been doing the book for about 18 months. So the first 6 months, first of all, it was a challenge during COVID in that, normally I would go to presidential libraries and collect a bunch of information about presidents and all that sort of thing. And you really couldn't do that. Most of the presidential libraries were closed. It was hard getting people. I mean, thank gosh for Zoom because I did a ton of interviews on Zoom. So a lot of times I would do an interview and then while it was fresh in my mind, I would write that up that day just so I had that piece done. Because I found that it's always easier to do that than go back and try to remember, well, what was the most interesting thing that person said? So for the most part, yes. As I got further along in it and I was having to come up with the connective tissue in between the anecdotes and the stories, less so. It was more just me writing, but certainly for the first 5 or 6 months, that's what I was doing.
And the book is Power Players, and it has a connection between politics and sports. Tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, so I have three great loves. My wife, sports, and politics. So, and my kids count as my wife, just in case you didn't think I was overlooking my kids. Yes. And so I wanted to figure out a way that I could smartly write about sports and politics. And weirdly, despite those being like two huge sort of parts of culture, there hasn't been that much written about the two of them together. There's obviously been lots written about sports and there's been lots written about politics. So what I wanted to do, what we came up with, my editor, Sean Desmond, who's at 12, who's wonderful and did my first book too. With the idea that we kind of came up with together was, well, let's look at the sports presidents played, loved, and spectated, and what that can tell us about who they are and how they governed, which, was a pie in the sky idea. It's not like I had like detailed analysis on each president and what, I sort of went into it hoping that this would work.
Right.
I came out of it just thrilled in that there's so much, like I'll give you one example. Richard Nixon was very into bowling. Obviously he had lanes put in the White House so he could bowl. He would go bowl by himself frequently. He was a pretty good bowler, 200 plus. But it's so telling that that's what Nixon was drawn to. Kind of this, like at the time, bowling was really big among blue collar workers, much more so than it is now. It was more part of the culture when he was president. and just the image of Richard Nixon bowling by himself, frame after frame at the White House. I mean, it's very telling of who the guy was. He also was. He is not terribly athletic. Out of all the presidents that I did, which is Eisenhower through Biden, he's
Okay.
probably among the least athletic. But
Mhm.
he played college football at Whittier College,
Really?
and there's a great stories about how he was basically just a tackling dummy. Like they would just annihilate him. Like he was little, he's not like striking. He's not like Gerald Ford, like a big, strong, athletic guy.
Yeah.
And that he would just like keep getting up and keep getting up. And he talks about his college coach. He talked about his college coach when he won the Republican nomination for president, about how important it was for him. He learned sort of what life was really like. And this image of Nixon just being like pummeled over and over again on the football field and getting up is, not dissimilar to Richard Nixon's
Political career.
political life, right? Of getting pummeled over and over again and just sort of like getting up. Like his best trait was that he was willing and able to absorb massive amounts of punishment. So
Wow.
it was honestly, it was sort of a release valve, a stress release valve for me to write the book. The last couple of years have been, starting with 2016 and then going through the pandemic and Trump's reelection and all that. I mean, it has been not an easy thing to do to be a political reporter.
Yeah.
Not only because you've been villainized by the president of the United States, but just the subject matter has not exactly been what I would call uplifting.
No.
It feels like the same thing over and over again. And this gave me a real outlet. Like I was talking to people sort of about politics, but not really.
Yeah.
And doing interviews, it just reminded me of what I really liked to do as a reporter, which is talking to people who are interested and interesting, and having them tell their stories. There's a lot of great stories in the book that haven't been reported before, and it gave me an outlet. So it was as beneficial for me writing it as I hope it will be for people reading it, because it just gave me something to do that wasn't the like, did you see what Trump tweeted today?
Yes. Well, yeah. And after a while, that gets to be fatiguing, for lack of
There's
a
only
better way to
some
put it.
there's it is, and the way that he certainly ran his White House was 24 hours a day on,
Mhm.
and I think that you get fatigued from that, just and like trying to find new angles of and trying to write things that are interesting and trying to hold him to account in and dealing with the fact that it's a president who, unlike every president I've covered, is not terribly interested in the truth, is exhausting. And so the book, actually, I know people say like you wrote a book to feel relieved of your stress, but in some ways I did.
I mean, and I think as a segue, I want to talk a minute about the podcast, because
Hmm.
that also feels to me like a reprieve from
Yeah.
political reporting in some degree. I mean, downside up, and you guys examine sort of small things that we take for granted,
Yep.
that, if they were not what they are, what would they be? Right. And so I
That's
probably
right.
haven't characterized it the right way,
No,
but
no,
I
no.
took a couple minutes to listen in. I think it's really fascinating. Tell me a little bit about that project.
So this is another you've got it exactly right. Another thing that was a break from my day job. We started thinking about this about 14, 15 months ago. I knew I wanted to do a podcast, but I knew two things. I wanted to do a podcast, and I didn't want to do a podcast of me talking to political people. Like not that there plenty of good podcasts already exist
There's
doing
right.
that.
Time for something new. Yeah.
Right. And so I knew I wanted it to be not about politics. I knew I wanted to be about something different. And I feel like I spent so much of my life in journalism trying to think of what if questions, essentially like, well, what if Kevin McCarthy isn't elected speaker on the House floor? What happens then? Trying to look around corners as it relates to like politics, but also life more generally. So that's where the idea came from. We were going to call it What If, but of course, there's a Marvel series called What If, so you can't just
Oh,
call it What If.
well, that'd be hard
Marvel,
competition.
Marvel, yeah, Marvel already kind of cornered the market on that, and I didn't think launching a podcast against Marvel would be a wise move. So
Oh,
we came
yeah.
up with Downside Up, which is I think is meant to convey exactly what you said. What if we changed one thing and it changed a lot of things. One of my favorite episodes is we did an episode about plastics, which again, you think like plastics, that sounds boring, but we did an episode of like, what if plastics didn't exist? What would replace it? What have plastics done environmentally and broadly speaking to sort of us as a society, single-use plastic? And there's so much interesting stuff in there about how it was developed and why it was developed. And it's just, we did a recent one on what if the NCAA didn't exist, the sort of the governing body of college sports. And I got to talk to people. I mean, one of the things, I'm sure you feel this way, one of the things that's really cool is you get to talk to people who are like really smart and interesting.
Definitely.
I got to talk to Paul Feinbaum of ESPN, Jay Billis of ESPN, talk to an athlete who was fined by the NCAA because unbeknownst to her, they had put a phone jack in her room that the school had paid for, and that counted as an unfair donation to the student, even though she was wholly unaware of it. Like, so it was just, again, I think that as I grow older and spend, I mean, I've been doing this since I was 22, so I'm 46 now. I think you are naturally drawn to try, I shouldn't say you, I am naturally drawn to try other things, to just kind of widen the aperture a little bit and, try to be more, people always say Twitter, on Twitter, people are like, stay in your lane, just talk about politics, which I get that impulse, but what my response always is like, how many people have you ever met that are only interested in one thing? Right. No. There's not, I mean, most of us, it's like, most of us have the job that we do, and then the things that we follow as hobbies or, pastimes. And I just wanted to sort of get a little broader than just like, hey, that's the guy who writes about politics. I'm never going to not write and talk about politics. That's the job, and I mean, I think that's the thing that I still do, especially the writing process. I still do really enjoy that, sort of thinking through what it should look like and how it should be framed and all that. But I also think there's more out there, and I wanted to sort of acknowledge that. So,
well, but you've always been an innovator. I mean, and I remember this back from
that's nice of you. Thank you.
When you were at the Fix. I know it's kind of a new buzzy word, but I mean this as a compliment to you. Even when you were writing the Fix, I mean, what you were producing was new and fresh and fast. And you said you're a fast writer, and that's something that you sort of pride yourself on. But you were quick about that. When news started to break, you'd have a quick sort of like comparison or like a historic note about how this was relevant or something that would draw people in. And then the Fix turned into an online news program at the Washington Post. So you've always kind of been in this lane where you're always looking for new, cool things to do.
It is. It's interesting. Thank you for framing it in that positive way. I sometimes I get frustrated in that, like, there isn't the sort of traditional path for me. It's like when I worked at the Post, there was like, you were a reporter, and then if you're good at that, you became an editor. That was like how it went. I never really wanted to become an editor. And in TV, it's like you're a correspondent and then you become an anchor, and like that's not the path for me either. So it's been a challenge, honestly, to try to do things differently. But I mean, I really do believe that we're in a space. I think of news in like three buckets, essentially: the what bucket, the now what bucket, and the so what bucket. News traditionally has spent 95% of its assets, resources, and everything else on the what bucket. This happened. I just want us to spend more of our time and energy on the so what, why does this matter, and the now what, what's next buckets. It's never going to be 80% so what and now what and 20% what. You always need the what. You always need the spine of this thing happened. Donald Trump announced for president. But I think telling people in, like you said, in a relatively quick manner, why is this thing that he said or thing that he did important, and now what should you look for? I think are real growth areas of journalism. I think that's where journalism is headed. I think people now want their analysis with their news. I mean, I remember when we first started in this, which we won't sort of date
No.
a while ago. Let's just leave it at that, leave it vague.
Yeah.
We would write the news, and then the next day, someone usually more senior than you would come in and do an analysis that would
Yes.
appear when I worked at the Washington Post, that would appear in the following day's paper, like
Mhm.
a think piece.
Mhm.
Now, I think that it's almost simultaneous. People want to read the news, but then they want to be told why does this piece of news matter in my life? I have so
Yeah.
much going on. Why is this thing important to me?
Mhm.
And I feel like the space between that news and then analysis has basically been reduced to almost nothing. That people want analysis with their news now.
I think that's
And
helpful too, though. I think
I
it's
think you've seen journalism adapt, I hope,
Mhm.
to that.
It gives me comfort too. I know that, especially having gone through this experience that we've gone through over the course of the last 6 years, putting it in the framework of this has happened before, maybe a little bit differently, maybe in another way. It gives me comfort in knowing that we transcended that time and hopefully we'll transcend this time as well. And
Yeah, I
so for
think
people like me
perspective
that are
matters.
having that perspective, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one benefit of getting older is I sort of have seen a lot of these things happen before. Although I will say some things that Trump has done and does, I'm still sort of like dumbfounded by. I mean, I will say that he says and does some things that I have not seen before.
Mhm.
But yeah, I do think I think people are not everyone, because there's extremes on both sides who just want to be told that whatever their opinion is right. But I think there's a lot of people who are passive news consumers who, maybe they listen to a news briefing on their Echo, or they read Apple News, or they're not totally detached from the news, but they're not in it every day like you and I are, right? They're not.
Sure.
It's not. They're not marinating in it. And I think for those
Well,
people, they want to know, why is this something that I need to pay attention to?
mhm.
Why does, out of all the things that are happening, why is this a thing that I should dedicate some 3, 4, 5 minutes of my time to?
Yeah.
And I feel like whether it's audio, whether it's video, whether it's TV, whether it's written word, I feel like we're all moving toward that space of trying to explain that to people.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt about it that that's something that I'm looking for, and I feel like others are looking for, especially that analysis. So you're a Georgetown grad.
I am.
Are you from the neighborhood originally?
I'm
Have you always
I'm
been here?
from Connecticut. No, I'm
Uh-huh.
from
Okay.
Connecticut, but I've been here since I graduated from Georgetown, which I will date myself and say was in 1998,
Mhm.
coming up on the 25th reunion.
I'm not gonna tell you that my number is bigger than yours, but I'm telling you my number is bigger
God,
than yours. Not by much.
20. My friends are like, "Are you coming to the 25th reunion?" And when you live in the town that the school is in, it's hard to be like, "No, I can't make it," when they're coming from all over the place. So
I'm
I
gonna
think I
tell
might
you,
get suckered
it
into
is
it.
a great reunion. That's a good number. When that number hits, all of a sudden there's something different that happens at 25. Nobody cares about
Yes.
who's who. It's like all the great stories of the old days come back through.
Okay, maybe I should go then. I've been debating. I feel like I kind of have to, because if my friends are flying in from like Iowa and Georgia and stuff, and I live 15 minutes from the campus, I probably need to go.
You got to do it. It's so
Yeah.
fun. But so did you go to school for journalism? What was your background? Like, did you always want to
No,
be a journalist?
no. I wanted to be an author, a fiction writer.
Okay.
So I wanted to do something with writing. I was an English major in college. Georgetown did not have a journalism major for
Mhm.
undergrads. There were graduate classes that you could take. They
Yeah.
do now. It's much more uh, fulsome now than it used to be. But I knew I wanted to write, but I didn't really know sort of how that would work. Like being a novelist at 19 I mean, people do it, but I was not in the space that I was going to do it. So it's a very weird story that I wound up into it. So George Will, the conservative columnist, hires Georgetown undergrads to work in his office. He always has.
Really?
And so when I was a sophomore, the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences approached me and said, "We have this set up with George Will. Would you be interested in working for him?" And like at the time, I was not into politics. I mean, I vaguely knew who he was because of his baseball writing, but not
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
anything else. But I think I'm remembering this right. I think he paid $12 an hour, which in 1996 was like, for me, no job.
It was
like was
pretty
a
good living.
king's ransom. Yeah. So I started to work for him. He has an office in Georgetown, so you could walk there. And so I started to work for him 3 or 4 days a week, worked for him in the summers. Um, did spent from my sophomore year to my senior year there working for him. And then after that, I didn't really know what to do, but he suggested that Charlie Cook, who's a political handicapper,
Mhm.
needed someone to like work in the office and that he could write me a recommendation. So I was like, okay. I mean, again, it was 98. The economy was not like booming. It wasn't disastrous, but it wasn't like jobs were everywhere.
Right.
Um, and so I took that job and I answered phones for Charlie. I did Charlie's schedule and I sort of learned about politics through him. And at the time, Amy Walter was there as
Mhm.
the House editor and Jennifer Duffy was there as the Senate editor. And they were just great to me. I was like, I was 22 and sort of just soaking everything up.
Yeah.
And I worked there for 3 years, and then I went and worked at Roll Call newspaper, which I always say was Politico, before the internet.
Yep.
Um, and then I got hired at the Washington Post to, as you mentioned, to write a blog, which, I always say to people, it feels like ancient history now, but like at the time, major news sites didn't have a blog. They
Mhm.
they sort of took what they put in the print newspaper and put it online. That was the extent of
Were
it.
you
There
at the
was no,
dot com? Were you at that dot com
yes,
that they
I
started?
was
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
.com
Okay.
in Virginia, yeah, in
Mhm.
Courthouse in Virginia,
Mhm.
and I was sort of a hybrid. I sat in the newsroom at the time 1150 15th Street, right there at 15th and M.
Mhm.
I sat in the Post building, but was a .com employee. This is when it's again hard to imagine, but this is when the digital operation was separate from
Yeah.
the print
Like
operation.
you and PK and Pershing was over there. There was a
Yep.
couple of guys over
Yep.
there with
We
you,
had a
right?
lot of Ed O'Keefe, who's now at CBS, was there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And, for me, it was a real blessing in that it didn't have the sort of gravitas of the newspaper in the best possible way, in
Mhm.
that there wasn't a whole group of people who were sort of saying when you write, it has to look like this and sound like this and be like this. It was much more like just fiddling around. Somebody said to me one time, what you were doing was building houses in a part of town nobody wanted to live in, but then it became the most popular part of town to live in, which I think is
Yeah.
sort of true.
Sounds right.
Like, I got to try stuff that I never would have been able to try had I just been like covering the White House for the Washington Post. Like I got to write with way more voice, do more audience interaction, um, just have more like just have a freer attempt at what journalism could look like right as journalism was changing, right? I
Mhm.
mean,
Mhm.
this was, in the mid 2000s. And that was when journalism was sort of realizing that its old model of classified ads and print newspaper was not going to survive
Mhm.
and looking for the next thing.
It
And
felt
I
like
just happened
it
to,
felt like a trial when you guys first went over there too, and then immediately it was clear that that was gonna be the direction
yeah.
that
I
everything
mean,
was going. It was amazing.
I still remember people being like, "You're going to work for WashingtonPost.com, not the Washington Post." And like at the time, it was seen as like, well, maybe this is a lateral move, maybe this, but like I
Yep.
think you have to try to see what the potential of a place is.
Right.
And so, yeah, I worked there for 10 years. It was great. I had wonderful colleagues and loved working there. And then the last 4 years I've been at CNN, which was really just about trying to, I always said to the Post people, I'm not really leaving the Post because I'm unhappy. I love being there, but I wanted to put my TV stuff under the same roof as all my other stuff. I was an MSNBC contributor when I worked at the Post, but the issue there was like on election night, well, do you work for the Post? Do you work for MSNBC?
I get
And
it.
so I wanted to put it all in one place. And that was, CNN has such a big reach in digital,
Yeah.
as well as obviously a TV station, that it
Mhm.
felt like the right fit.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a
That's okay.
long-winded way of saying
That's
my
good.
career.
That's the whole point of this. That's the whole point of the conversation.
Okay.
So that's a good thing. Um, so then, okay, so we have a book, podcast, and then you're editing and you're on TV like frequently,
Yeah.
doing a lot of that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's cool in that it's all different muscles to exercise.
Mhm. Yep.
Doing television is very different than writing. Doing TV is very much like immediate and in the moment, and writing I think can be more reflective and offer you a little bit more chance to show your personality. But I sort of like, I guess I like that I can do a bunch of different things in a day. I can do the podcast. I can write, which I still, if I had to choose the thing that I enjoy the most in my job, it's still the writing piece of it, and the
Mhm.
talking to people, and thinking about politics and trying to think of what to say and why.
Yeah.
But I just think having those various buckets that you can sort of play in, and I think increasingly journalistically, we need to think of ourselves as like we need to play in every place that there are people.
Mhm.
I think we no longer, I don't really think, there are very few exceptions that like a TV anchor, like they don't do anything else but anchor. I don't know that that is going to exist for that much longer. Like, look, a good example is Jake Tapper. Like, yes, he's like our lead anchor, but he also has written a novel. He wrote the cover story for The Atlantic recently. Like I think that that's the model for future journalists. It's like Swiss Army knife. You can do a lot of different things.
Mhm.
Because I do think even just if I only wrote for the website, I think that there would be like, well, what else can you do here? I think you want to show as much value as you can. And the way that you do that is by like going to where people are, like people we know consume podcasts. All right, well, let's make sure that if they like my writing, they have an option to consume my podcast. Or if they see me on TV, they know that I have a newsletter every single night that they can get.
Yeah.
And trying to make all those things talk to each other.
And it all comes through. Honestly, like your personality comes through in all of them, and that I think is a very good mark of what you're doing. So I mean that as a
I'm trying.
compliment, but it's really
Thank
fun
you.
because it feels fun and light and smart, but also sort of balanced in the facts and history, and it's cool from the outside watching.
I think that the thing that I have is that I'm passionate about what I do.
Mhm.
And in my view always is like, if you can't be excited about what you're doing, it's going to be hard to convince someone to read something that isn't, or watch something or listen to something.
Yeah.
So I try to bring that to everything. And the great thing about CNN is it's given me like the opportunity to do all sorts of different cool stuff.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
whether it's a podcast or my YouTube show or the newsletter or just the writing or TV, like there's a lot of ways to farm out content in ways that, if you're me, is gratifying.
So if
Would
you're creating as much content as you are, you must
Mhm.
also be consuming content. So can you tell me one or two must reads for you in the morning? Like what do you have to
So
see?
yeah, so I like a year ago, I set up a newsletters folder and made a bunch of rules that just the newsletters go in there. So I do read Axios. I do read Politico Playbook
Mhm.
every morning. I read the New York Times newsletters. I feel like the answer to your question is essentially newsletters plus Twitter,
Got it.
uh, which, who knows with Twitter, but it is integral to, I think, my and many journalists, like
Yeah,
how you collect news, because
absolutely.
everyone in our world operates on that.
Mhm.
Politicians put out their statements on it. Uh, there's back and forth on Twitter that becomes stories. So, but I would say, I think newsletters now have become my main source of kind of what I look at. I mean, that's true outside of politics too. New York Times has a newsletter called Watching, which is a TV and movies thing. So I
Awesome.
use
I'm
that
putting
as
it on
like
my list.
yes, I use that as like the newsletter to figure out what my wife and I should watch next.
Yeah.
But I find that that is mostly what I'm doing. I get the Sunday New York Times. I read the Sunday New York Times, like print New York Times. I get. I try to read the Post when I can, just because it's the newspaper. It's not only the home newspaper of living in this area, but it's also where I worked for a decade, and I know a lot of the people and know how good they are.
Right.
Um, but uh, that's honestly, it's not that much more than that. I feel like those things give me a good sense of, one of the things I do every day is try to figure out, okay, where is the energy on the political internet, and what can I say interesting about that?
Mhm.
And I think newsletters and Twitter give you a good sense of at least where the energy is. You always have to have it with a caveat, like, yes, 20% of the public is on Twitter, so let's not pretend it's like everyone. But in terms of sniffing out a lead or something that might be interesting, or a politician said something that's problematic for him or her, like, I think it's really helpful in that regard.
Yeah. I totally get that, and then you just try to dive a little deeper or sort of put some emphasis on why that's important and sort of
Right,
add the
just dig a
crystallizes.
little.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
I
And
get that.
over time I figured out basically what my voice should be like. And one of the things that I really value is the ability to write in non like newspaper speak.
Mhm.
Like I think it's really of value to be able just to say stuff,
Wow.
and say like, this is good, this is bad. I'm a nonpartisan referee. This ad is bad because of X, Y, and Z, not because it's a Republican ad, not because it's a Democratic ad, but just because it's the bad ad.
In another episode, because we do 30 minutes here at the Friday Reporter, you and I are going to talk about what that voice gets you when you have critics that are coming to you on the internet. 'Cause I see a lot
A
of
lot
people,
of
a
critics.
lot of people coming for you.
Yes, I mean, in my best days, I think of that as it's a testament to my relevance that
Mhm.
people don't come after irrelevant people. On my worst days, I'm pretty thin-skinned and it hurts my feelings.
How
But
can you not
I,
be?
I, I think people don't. I think people, you get to a certain point in your career, and people don't see you as a human anymore. I don't think they grasp that like the things they're saying is about another human who is just like,
For
in my
sure.
case, like just trying to do the best that you can. So yeah, that's a whole other
That's another
that that
episode.
that's the 3-hour podcast that you
Yeah, no
do.
doubt. All right. So final question.
Yep.
Is always who would I talk to for a future episode? Who would you recommend?
So I'm going to tell you someone who I think has had like a really fascinating career arc. Sarah Seidner at CNN. Sidner. She's a correspondent. She briefly hosted a show on CNN Plus. I think she's fascinating and interesting, and would be like a really thoughtful guest for you.
Love it. I'm gonna
Yeah,
tell her you nominated her.
tell her I nominated her.
I'm
I don't
going
have
to.
any problem with that.
Cillizza, I'm thrilled to have you today. Thank you
Oh
so
my
much for
gosh!
being a
Thank you
guest.
for having me.
Absolutely.